Exercising consistently and appropriately for your body is one of the best things that you can do to strengthen and improve the health of your heart. But so often we think that heart health just means doing cardio or aerobic exercise. On today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we want to dispel this idea and explain why you should be lifting weights if you want to keep your heart healthy. We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Charlie. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to let you know that we recently released a book called The Exercise for Life Method. And if you enjoy the conversations that we have every single week on this podcast, then you are going to love this book. So to pick up a free copy of this book, all you have to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise that's geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. Now, so often we think that, well, what if I want to build the health and function of my heart? Like, what if I want my heart to be healthier? I want my heart to be stronger. Do I really need to be focusing on doing exercise that strengthens my muscles? Shouldn't I just be doing cardio or aerobic exercise? And this is an idea that perpetuates the fitness industry, the mainstream health industry. And so we want to talk about this today and actually take a second to explain why using resistance training can be one of the best things that you do in order to improve the health and function of your heart.
Charlie, I'm so glad we're talking about this today because I actually think these are way more closely related than people think. You know how like when you talk to someone that might be really holistic or really maybe they call themselves functional, it almost seems like they're going at such a big scope of a picture that you're like, well, how is that eventually going to help me? I guess maybe, but it won't be like as direct as like, medicine version. And I think we often think about that, like when we think, oh, I want to exercise because I know I need to keep my heart healthy, or, my family has a family history of heart events, so I should do cardio because that's what keeps your heart healthy. And when we bring up this idea that resistance training keeps your heart healthy, it's not as far distanced as you might think. I am so glad we're talking about this because heart issues are a huge thing for Americans today. I mean, there are so many people, it's so prevalent where people are having heart attacks or some of the chronic negative health changes that lead to heart difficulties, and they actually make your heart have to work more. So it is important that we're talking about how can we use exercise to also start to address this issue, because it is, as I just said, so common. You probably know someone that has suffered from a heart event.
Yeah, I love that you brought up that last point, Julie, because you're right. This conversation is going to kind of cover two different main points. Is one, how does resistance training directly help you improve the health and function of your heart and strengthen your heart? But then also, how does it indirectly help you improve the health and function and strengthen your heart through helping to ward off some chronic issues that lead to heart issues? So I like that you brought that up because you're right. We're going to hit both points with this. And let me just start by saying, first and foremost, we are not saying that, cardio or aerobic exercise doesn't strengthen or improve the health and function of your heart. In fact, it can be incredibly useful for that. But I think there's too much emphasis put on solely doing that or only doing that. And there's a great misunderstanding of the role that resistance training can and does play in helping you to not only keep doing cardio, but actually improve the health and function of your heart overall.
So when we're thinking about resistance training and cardio, if we exclude resistance training, you're using a whole bunch of different muscles and you're lifting weights up and down, and cardio, you're doing this, this thing, whether it's running or cycling. But if we think about what is your body doing when you do these exercises, and we exclude what we relate to them, meaning like maybe weight training, you think of bodybuilding, and cardio, you think of distance athletes or for heart health. Cardio, one of the things that is just part of the nature of cardio is that it's highly repetitive. It's highly repetitious, meaning if you think about, okay, I love to go for walks for my cardio and I go for 30 minutes. Well, walking for 30 minutes is 30 minutes of the same movement over and over and over again. And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It just, that is what it is. And if you say, well, I love cycling, an hour of cycling is my jam. Well, that's great. You also just did 1 hour of the same motion using probably almost the same muscles for an hour. It was repetitive. That's what I mean by repetitive. Now, on the other hand, resistance training is somewhat repetitive because you don't just do one squat and you're done, but there is way less repetition because if you go for a walk for 30 minutes, you might be getting 10,000 steps. But if you're going to go do squats in the gym, you might do, 10 reps twice, 20 of them, or 30 of them. It's nowhere near the amount of repetition. Not only that, when you do resistance training, you are using different areas of your body and different motions. So if you think about walking for 30 minutes, think about what your legs are doing. They're going forward and back and forward and back and forward and back over and over and over again. When you do your resistance training, your legs might go forward and back for one exercise. They might go out and in for the next exercise. The next one might include your knees or exclude your knees. Oh, and then you go into your trunk and core exercises. So there's variations in what your body is going to be doing when you do resistance training. Now, that might bring up some challenges for people as well, meaning if there are areas of people's body or your body that doesn't feel good when you do resistance training, but the motion of walking feels good, well, then there's some comfort in that, hey, I can walk and I know I won't be sore and achy the next day, or I won't flare up my shoulder issue. But if I do resistance training, I'm probably going to flare up my shoulder issue. I'm probably going to irritate my back. So there are pros and cons to both. I guess I don't mean to say pros and cons, but facts that go with both. And they're just considerations to take in mind. But there are specific pros to the resistance training that a lot of people don't acknowledge when it comes to heart health.
Now, where this fits in and how this ties back to heart health is when looking at being able to do cardio or aerobic exercise consistently, we kind of want to talk about the two different types of exercise. And we talk about exercise that uses your body and exercise that builds or rebuilds your body, okay? And the way that most people perform their cardio or their aerobic exercise is it ends up being a form of exercise that uses their body, meaning they are doing the physical activity for an external goal. They're doing the physical activity, they're doing the run to travel 5K. They're doing the cycle class to be on the bike for 60 minutes. They are doing the step aerobics to burn X number of calories. So it's all stuff that is relatively outside of the body. Now, that doesn't mean that that's only for cardio, right? Because that same mindset can be applied to resistance training as well, right? There are many people out there who do resistance training to see the weight go up and down 3 sets of 10. So this mindset can be applied to both, but that frames a majority of cardio within the idea of it's exercise that uses your body, all right? The challenge with exercise that uses your body is that it's often done in sacrifice of the health and function of your body, okay? And you talk to people who do consistent cardio for long periods of time, and the reality is many of them have ended up sacrificing some aspect of the health and function of their body that ultimately limits their ability to keep doing the cardio, to keep doing the aerobic exercise. You talk to people who run or who used to run, and the same complaint keeps coming up. Well, I ran until my knees couldn't take it anymore. And then I switched to biking, and biking felt good for a while for my knees, but then my hips and my back started bothering me. So then I switched to swimming, and swimming was great until my shoulders started to bug me. And now it's like, well, I'm trying to find some combination of doing elliptical versus, something else to, get my cardio in. And it's all done of like, okay, well, I'm going to sacrifice the rest of my body in order to try to strengthen my heart, versus looking at exercise that builds or rebuilds your body. And the whole goal of doing that is to improve the health and function of your body. All right. Now, here's the thing. This is most easily done doing resistance training. Okay. You can do aerobic exercise and cardio in this way, but it's much more difficult, and it needs a strong foundation of high functioning muscles and high functioning joints. All right. And then that will allow you to then do the aerobic exercise in the manner that builds or rebuilds your body. So that's a piece that is missing from the majority of the stories out there about using cardio to build the health and function of your heart, is that, well, you need to make sure your muscles are functioning well first, and you need to make sure that your joints are functioning well, and then that will allow you to use cardio or aerobic exercise in the manner that you're intending. And so understanding these two types of exercise, that's kind of key for that.
Charlie, you're so right with that idea where it's like, hey, to do this repetitive thing that we call cardio, I have to do something. Like, I have to make my insurance policy. What am I going to do to make sure that I can keep doing cardio? And in fact, if you're listening to this, you might be like, yeah, well, I kind of see what you're saying. But actually, this idea that we should sacrifice our body, or that it's so common to sacrifice our body for cardio, and sacrifice, I mean, you're actually making the health and function of your body worse. There are common things that I'm going to say in just a moment that we accept about cardio that we don't even realize. So for example, I have a handful of clients that will say, oh no, I don't jog because it's just too jarring on the knees. And it can be jarring on the knees, especially if you're not doing something to maintenance the muscles. Some people are in the mindset that cardio is too intense or is too repetitive, or that some styles, for example, running is jarring on the knees. It becomes this thing that we start to dismiss, where there could be so many health benefits to doing that knee jarring exercise, but it actually might not be that knee jarring for you if you're going to add in the resistance training piece to then keep and maintenance the muscles that are supposed to be supporting your knees and feet and hips and core, so that it's not jarring on the knees. Another example that I hear a lot is, oh, I just can't do the rower machine because it just flares up my back every time. So that's another one where it's this repetitious activity on your spinal extensors. And yeah, it is repetitious. There are great benefits to doing it. But at the same time, it will be taxing and stressful on your low back if you're not doing appropriate resistance training to maintenance the muscles that allow you to do cardio. So really think about that when you're doing your cardio, and you might feel like, oh, this repetitious thing, the biking doesn't work well for me, or the running doesn't work well for me. And yeah, some things work better for other people than other exercises, and that's cool. But there is so much that can be done if you're doing regular resistance training and maintaining your body and or tuning up your body, and then you're able to participate more in more various types of cardio, number one, and number two, for a longer period of time, because we really have to be getting these health benefits from exercise for as long as you live. So if you're running now, I want you still running when you're, retired and past retirement. And if you're swimming now, I want you to keep swimming until you no longer can swim. So we want to see that this cardio event, also this resistance training, this whole exercise journey lasts for your life, not just for the next 6 months or year or 3 years.
Yeah, so that's the first reason why adding in resistance training, if you're really focused on strengthening your heart, is such a big deal, because ultimately it will allow you to keep doing your aerobic exercise for longer. That's something really important to understand, is it's going to provide, like Julie was saying, that insurance policy for your muscles and for your joints to help support those areas. So when you go and you use your body during the aerobic exercise and doing your cardio, it's not as stressful on your muscles and on your joints. Because the reality is most people don't stop doing aerobic exercise because it's too stressful for their heart. I'm not saying all people, but most people stop doing aerobic exercise because it's too stressful for their muscles and joints. And so those are the limiting factors in people's longevity when it comes to being able to do aerobic exercise. So resistance training plays a key role in making sure that those areas stay functioning well and stay feeling well. Now, the next point to bring up is that the thing that actually improves the health and function of your heart is challenging your muscles. And I know that seems really weird, right? Like, wait, what do you mean? Like, challenging my muscles improves the health and function of my heart? And that's, I mean, that's very straightforward. Like that's what I mean. Challenging your muscles, the improvements that you see in your heart health are a direct result of the intensity, frequency, and the duration with which you challenge your muscles. Okay. Now, when looking at, Julie did this great kind of compare contrast between aerobic exercise and resistance training. And, where aerobic exercise has a leg up on resistance training is from the duration standpoint. Like, people do a 20-minute run or a 60-minute run or whatever. You're not going to sit down on a leg press and do a 20-minute leg press or a 60-minute leg press, right? So the duration just isn't there for resistance training. However, the intensity is, and because you're able to challenge different areas of your body, you can also do it with a heightened amount of frequency where you can do, like lower body one day and then your upper body and, mix in some core, and you can repeat that, a couple times a week. And so you're able to get the frequency in, and you're able to get the intensity of the challenge in. And because you're able to do both of those, it can kind of make up for the fact that the duration of challenge isn't as great with aerobic exercise. And so you can still see tremendous improvements in the health and function of your heart through doing resistance training.
Charlie, I don't know about you, but also when I lift weights, my heart rate is up.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how that works, right?
Yeah. And what's also interesting, and this might be a really new idea for you. You're like, really? Like, if I do weights, then, my heart rate will get up. If you're exercising right now and you say, well, I do lift weights, but my heart rate doesn't really get that high. There's also this other myth thing that's been going around, especially if you are a woman. And there's this thing where you read women's health magazines or healthy little programs online or on television, and they talk about, well, all you have to do is light weights. Grab your bands, get your yoga on, and do the light weights. And I think we love that, especially as women, because it feels like, okay, well, great. I'm not going to get bulky and I'm not going to get hurt, right? Like those two things are awesome. But the problem is that because heavy weights seem intimidating, then the solution shouldn't be just light weights. The solution is then appropriate weights. Like no one should be lifting heavier than they should, right? No one should be lifting heavier than what's appropriate, right? But we should all be lifting heavy relative to what our body's tolerance is. And when we're lifting heavy relative to what our body's tolerance is, then number one, if you're doing it appropriately, you don't get injured usually. And number two, your heart rate will get up because it is hard work on your muscles. Just like Charlie said, when your muscles are challenged, that's when your heart rate will increase. So what's heavy and appropriate for Charlie is different than what's heavy and appropriate for me and what's heavy and appropriate for you. So it really has to be individualized because, again, it's what is challenging for your muscles. And everyone's condition of muscle and preparedness of muscle is different at any point in time. So we're not saying lift heavy and that means one thing. We say you gotta lift heavy to challenge your heart, but lifting heavy means a million different things, meaning whoever is listening to this, it's different for you than it is for any other listener or for Charlie or I.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And I think another way of framing the heavy is thinking about challenge. The word heavy brings up these, like Julie was saying, these feelings of intimidation. Then think, okay, well, it's not that I necessarily need to lift a lot of weight, but I need to lift to a really high challenge. And I think one of the biggest problems with the idea of lifting light is there's also this implied notion of Well, it doesn't need to be that challenging. Because it's light, that means, you stop while it's still not that challenging. And so if you're concerned about, lifting a large amount of load, do a lighter load, but bring it to a really high level of fatigue. So it's really, really, really challenging. Because at the end of the day, your muscles don't really know the amount of weight that you're using. What they know is the amount of challenge that they're having to overcome. And so you can take a weight that you feel like, okay, yeah, this isn't that heavy, and do it and do it and do it. And it becomes really fatiguing and really challenging by the end. So that would be an alternative or just another option for you if you're still hesitant to try to, lift heavier even relative to what you can do.
Charlie, you're totally right. It's like our muscles don't really get the memo. Like, okay, you have 10-pound dumbbells in your hand. Be scared of this one. Oh, 5s are good. 10's too much. We're like nervous about the 10s. Anyways, our muscles don't know. They know challenge, and that is all we can provide to them. Another way to figure out, well, how do I know, like, if light's too light, then how do I figure out this challenge thing, especially if you have some apprehension to it, is do it in stages. And this is what I do with my clients all the time. And I see this firsthand with clients, especially if they were new, but I see this with seasoned exercisers too, like people that have been exercising for 10, 20 years, is that the discomfort of exercise or like that muscle squeezing, it can get kind of overwhelming in terms of like you have to be really in your body. That's all you can kind of think about. So unless you've ever challenged yourself to a certain level, you don't really know that you can do that challenge until you've done it. And so that brings up the next question was like, well, how do I know if I'm going to tolerate that? Like, is that going to lead me back down the path of injury that I'm trying to avoid, or the soreness and achiness? I know you guys are all anti-sore and achiness. So a way you can do it is through stages. So for example, let's just pick an exercise like the leg press. Okay, you've learned how to appropriately set up the leg press by following our Instagram, which we review that. You've learned how to cue yourself through the exercise. These things are the things to make sure you're safe. And then you're like, okay, well, how do I get the challenge, right? So Charlie brought up your body doesn't know weight. So you could do a lot of reps with the right form and really fatigue the tissue. But then if you're thinking about how can I add some weight? I've always thought 100 was like all I could do. Well, you could do your sets and reps at 100 and then see how you feel the rest of the day and the next day. If you're like, wow, feel great. There's no problems. I feel like, okay, I worked my buns, but they're not sore. They're not achy. I'm not having back pain. I'm not having knee pain. Great. Then the next time, do a little micro adjustment. Try 105 and then try 110. And then try 115 and see where does your body tell you to stop. Again, we don't want any negative repercussions. The beautiful part of these micro adjustments or these little tiny changes is that, remember, we're planning to exercise for our whole life. So for me, I'm hoping that's going to be the next 60 years. I've got a long time to figure this thing out, and we're always going to be adjusting. So you don't just have, a week to get your weights perfectly right and, hit the right weights and the appropriate challenge that we're talking about. You have a long time. So keep micro adjusting, play with things, add a little bit here, add a little bit there, take away here, add reps. But in the end, we want to see that your muscles are being appropriately and significantly challenged so that you are getting these health benefits.
And that really brings us right into the third reason why it's so important for you to be doing resistance training if you are concerned about improving the health and function of your heart. And this is one that's a little bit more indirect in nature, and it's because of some of the benefits that you can get simply from building muscle and building muscle tissue. And that is, when you build muscle, you improve what's called your insulin sensitivity, which means that your body is able to better utilize the insulin that your body is producing. It becomes more efficient at that, all right? So you're able to have then better control over your blood glucose levels, and your body is not having to produce as much insulin in the process. Why this is important is because one of the biggest things that compromises the health of somebody's heart and cardiovascular system overall is a condition called insulin resistance, where your body needs to produce more and more and more insulin in order to get the same blood glucose lowering effects. Now, this is a huge contributor to heart disease, to heart attacks, to arteries that are hardening, to stroke. If you're looking at, health and function of your cardiovascular system, minimizing the likelihood and the prevalence of insulin resistance for you, that's a really big deal. And resistance training from what we're going to call a special event exercise perspective is one of the best things that you can do in order to boost your insulin sensitivity and lower your insulin resistance.
Charlie, that point is one of my favorites because so often when we think about preventing insulin resistance or changing your lifestyle because you have insulin resistance, it's always diet related. And we always forget that, hey, we can actually change something with our body that also is not diet related. And I was just thinking of this analogy, and I just think it's going to be amazing, and then I'll tie it back. And if it's not amazing, I'm editing it out. But anyways, so let's say this. When you drive your car, it gets wear and tear, right? And it's not like a human body where it like adapts. It's like, oh, the more potholes you hit, the more it becomes resilient to potholes. No. The more potholes you hit, the more wear and tear your poor car gets. And here in Chicagoland, there is a lot of potholes. Actually, Charlie just went on like a pothole prevention plan where I think you're studying every pothole on the way to work so that you don't hit them anymore. Anyways, so your car is developing wear and tear. And there's a couple things that you can do to extend the life of your car because you drive a car, it's going to get wear and tear. There's no way to prevent it. You can minimize it, but you can't prevent it, right? So number one, you could drive it less, right? You drive your car less wear and tear. Great. It's going to last longer. Or you can take it into the shop and get it maintenanced, right? It's like I drive it a lot and I get it maintenanced. Now, probably a combo of this is the best thing, but oftentimes you think, well, I gotta go to work, I gotta take my kids places, so I gotta drive it. So that means I also have to take it into the shop to get it maintenanced. Okay, how does this relate to insulin resistance? Usually when we're developing insulin resistance or, your doctor's like, well, you got some insulin resistance, the normal thing that is often recommended is to bombard the system less with sugar, which is your nutrition, which is what we normally think. Oh, I got to eat better. I got to eat less junk. I got to eat less sugar, less carbs, all that stuff. So that's like saying, I'm going to drive my car less. I'm just going to bombard the system less. But what we often don't realize is that there's a way to maintenance your body so that it gets better at handling all the driving. It gets better at handling all the sugar. That is exercise. So when you exercise and keep your muscles strong and challenge them consistently, this is what's going to help you prevent insulin resistance from an exercise perspective. Now, I'm not saying it's a good idea to say, oh yeah, well, if I just exercise all the time, then I can bombard it with carbs and sugar. No, there's a balance, right? But that balance also doesn't mean you should only focus on nutrition. Just like your car. It's not saying, well, I bought this car and, because I want to make sure that it doesn't get wear and tear, I'm just not going to drive it anywhere. Okay, well, the point of having a car is so that you can get places. But there's also a balance. We don't want to be driving it across the country twice a week, but we also don't want to be not driving anyway. So anyways, I just thought that analogy was like a interesting one where I think we've all related to wear and tear in our car, but we often don't think about using exercise and diet to control insulin resistance because they both have such a potent influence on our ability to manage our glucose levels.
You are absolutely correct. And that analogy, that was one of my favorites.
Did you like it?
Yeah, that was wonderful.
I think we'll probably have to use it again in another podcast and smooth it out. But that was my first time delivering it.
First delivery?
And thinking it was pretty decent.
Yeah, no, that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so why should you be lifting weights if you want to focus on your heart health? Well, number one, lifting weights is going to help to improve the health and function of your muscles and joints, which that will ultimately allow you to keep doing aerobic exercise for longer. Number two is because the adaptations that your heart undergoes through exercise are a direct result of the challenge that's provided to your muscles, the intensity of the challenge, the frequency of the challenge, and the duration of the challenge. And so doing resistance training is a really great way to provide some higher intensity challenge to your muscles and still make sure that it's appropriate for your muscles and for your joints. And number 3, doing resistance training will give you an opportunity to build more muscle, and that will allow you to better control any potential insulin resistance that's developing in your body through promoting insulin sensitivity with the increased muscle mass. So if we're talking about what should you be doing from an exercise perspective in order to maintain and promote the health, function, and strength of your heart, resistance training is going to be a large part of that equation. It doesn't mean completely neglect aerobic exercise or traditional cardio, but you certainly should not be omitting resistance training. That needs to be included across the board. Now, if you enjoyed this conversation, there's a lot of these points that are made in our book, The Exercise for Life Method, that you can go back and you can listen to this podcast and you can visit those points in the book and kind of get a deeper dive of some of the things that we talked about on this podcast. So definitely recommend checking that out. And you can get your copy by going to exerciseforlifemethod.com. And while you're online, if you wouldn't mind, head on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. So how'd you like that episode? Did you find the information useful? If you enjoyed what we discussed today, then you are going to love the Exercise for Life Method, which is a book that we just put out and you can get a free copy of by going to exerciseforlifemethod.com. All we ask is that you pay for shipping and handling, so head there now and get your free copy, as well as some exclusive bonuses that you will get instant access to when you get the book. You can learn more and get your copy at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Cates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.